and on ethics today, right and wrong. So Warburton, in our reading, he asks a few basic questions about ethics. Ethics is, of course, the study of what is right, what is wrong in terms of our actions, behavior, what we think about in, for humans, maybe for all species, maybe in a metaphysical sense of what is right and wrong. And we also think about, what makes a particular action right or wrong. What makes, how should we live? The question is, what should we do with our lives and what is the definition of what is good? How do we define what is good? How do we define what is bad? And so these are hard questions, right? Because they don't necessarily have an easy answer. We don't have necessarily an easy answer for these things. So what do you think? What makes an action right or wrong? How should we live? I mean, that's a very general question. What does it even mean? How should we live? How do you interpret this question? How should we live? And what would be your answer? What makes things like torture, murder, and rape? These are things I think we all agree already that they're wrong. But why is it that we all agree that those things are wrong? What makes those things wrong? It's actually, it's just to start off with, it's interesting that if you talk to, probably most humans throughout history, they would all agree that those things would be wrong. They might have actually had some circumstances where they thought it was okay to do those things, or they actually did those things. But normally, at some point, they would say, well, if it was my sister, if it was me, or if it was my parents, if any of those things were done to them, then that would be wrong. So why is it that what makes those things? What is our basis for saying that those things are wrong? Even though we agree they're wrong, but in philosophy, we need to ask why. We need to ask why is it that those things are wrong. There's another way to talk about ethics is this word moral philosophy. So these are two ways of talking about the same thing. So you'll see that in literature that you read. So what do you think of this phrase by Nietzsche? Now Nietzsche made this claim, and I'm just quoting it from Warburton here, but he said, moral philosophers or ethicists end up justifying a desire of the heart that has been filtered and made abstract. So what does that phrase mean, and what do you think of it? Desire. So Nietzsche is basically saying this comes from all of our ethical ideas of how the whole world should work, so made abstract. We have these general principles, we think how the world should act. They all started with our own personal desire. So each individual person has started with some sort of desire, and basically they came up with an abstract idea by these individual ideas of I don't want people to take things from me, so I'm going to come up with an idea that's more abstract about stealing. I don't want people to hurt each other because I don't want somebody to hurt me, so I'm going to make this more abstract idea of what should and should not be done in terms of how we treat people. So I think one thing we can take from this is Nietzsche's perspective is what we're going to see later, a little bit more of what we would call moral relativism. Do you guys remember reading about this in the reading of Warburton? We're going to get to it at the very end of the lecture, but moral relativism is the belief that each individual, or in most situations, each society, it comes up with their own ideas of what is right and wrong. So in other words, there's no absolute basis for right and wrong. We all have to come up with our own ideas of what is right and wrong. So this is Nietzsche's ideas, which are different than, say, traditional societies. Like Judeo-Christian society believe that it's God that gives the command of what is right and wrong. I think the Confucius society, that's a good question. According to Confucius, what was the basis for what is right and wrong? So what are the three theories of ethics that Warburton discusses? Do you remember this? Christian, okay. Duty-based theories. And what's the last one? Utilitarian, yes. And actually, so you've named three, but actually three, okay, the duty-based, the Christian belongs, according to Warburton at least, and we're going to discuss this later, but the duty-based, Christian belongs to duty-based, okay? We're going to find out, though, that actually Warburton's wrong about this, because it's a little bit more complicated than that. The utilitarian belongs to the consequentialist. Do you remember that term? Okay, so there's consequentialist, and utilitarian is actually one consequentialist theory. Okay. There's what? Kantian ethics, yeah. Now Kantian ethics also belongs to duty-based. So we got duty-based and we got consequentialist. Okay. What's the third one? There's a third one.
Virtue.
Yes, virtue-based. Good. So there they are right there. Duty-based, consequentialist, and virtue-based. Okay, so we're going to first look at the duty-based theories. And I believe, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Kongzi, Kongmeng Zhuyi, yeah, is a duty-based theory. What do you think about that? Would you agree? Okay, what do you think? Okay, but what was the two that was discussed by Warburton, the two duty-based theories? So we can bring in Confucius as kind of a separate topic, but based on just Warburton, what are two duty-based theories? We already mentioned them, actually. I just want to see if Lydia remembers. So these are the two duty-based theories that Warburton discusses. And so first, we can talk about Christian ethics. So Christian ethics has, according to Warburton here, dominated Western understanding of morality. Even the atheistic ethical theories are heavily indebted to it. So this is very interesting that I don't think we can deny or get away from, at least in the West. Maybe we can say it's different in different parts of the world, but at least in Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Russia as well, that these things have had these ideas about morality have had a huge impact on the way that we organize our society in those countries, and even in since the probably the early 20th century, I would say it's the same with Africa, South America, and well, even before in South America. So if you look at a good portion of the world has been really impacted by the Christian ethics. Now we could also talk about Islamic ethics, and which are very similar. So this is still part of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. And if you include that, which includes the Middle East, countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, then you're looking at a large portion of society has based their ethics on a very similar set of ideas and principles. So right is then defined as what God wills. According to Warburton, this is his way of looking at Christian ethics. And wrong is defined as against God's will. Okay, but the question then, and then these are some examples of that. So the absolute commands, what that means is that the absolute commands come from an external authority, and that external authority is God. So you have things like the Ten Commandments, and you have things like Christ's teaching, love thy neighbor as thyself. And in a sense, according to Warburton here, it's a system of do's and don'ts. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. Are you familiar with the Ten Commandments? Are you guys familiar with that? Because that might be something that's new to you. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. A lot of Americans used to know what the Ten Commandments were until about maybe 50, 60 years ago, but a lot of things have changed, and those things, that doesn't seem to be emphasized as much. But even if people didn't agree with them, most people knew them about 50, 60 years ago. Now, I'll go ahead and run through them for you. So the first one is that you need to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and well, it's not heart, soul, mind, and strength, but you need to love God and worship him only, so that there's only one God, and that God you need to worship and serve only. The second one is something like you should not have, and these are all paraphrased, I'm not giving you exact, but you shouldn't make idols. So that was the second commandment, not to make any engraved images or idols of any kind. The third one, I'm going to see if I can actually remember all these. The third one is that you shouldn't take God's name. So he has and this is the name is a representation of his character and who he is as a person. You shouldn't take that and be disrespectful to it. That's called taking the Lord's name in vain. It's not, I believe it's not saying just like you shouldn't say, oh my God, or something like that, although some people believe that that's the case. And according to the Jews, they weren't even allowed to pronounce the name Yahweh. So there's a name Yahweh, which is God's name, the only name that we know of that God gives himself in the Old Testament, that they weren't even allowed to say that name. Actually, we're guessing that that's what it was pronounced as. We don't even know what it was exactly pronounced as, but that seems like a rough estimate, something like Yahweh. But the actual essence of this command, the third command, was that you shouldn't be, in a way, disrespectful to God. Like you wouldn't want to be disrespectful to your own parents. You wouldn't say horrible things about them that aren't true. You wouldn't want to drag them through the mud, so to speak. The fourth one is that you should keep the Sabbath day holy. Now, what is the Sabbath day? Well, it was one day out of the 7 days of the week that you were supposed to rest. And so you were commanded to have one day off once a week. It's kind of nice, actually, right? How would you like that? Yeah, you can't do any studying, you can't do any work, you just have to rest one day a week. So that was one of the commandments. The fifth commandment was to honor your father and mother. So to give, like similar to what Confucius said, honor your father and mother. I believe 6, 7, and 8, and I might get this wrong in the order, but you shouldn't murder, you shouldn't commit adultery, so you should stay faithful to your wife and not sleep around with other people outside of your marriage, and you shouldn't steal anything. And then the ninth and 10th, ninth is something like don't covet, so don't want what other people have. You should be content with your own things. And the 10th is to basically not tell lies. What it was that you're not supposed to take your neighbor to court. And those two might be, I might have mixed the order, but they're in there somewhere. But if you tell a lie, or if the context of it was actually, if you take somebody to court and you have false witness, you say, this person stole, or this person killed that person, but actually you're actually saying it falsely. It didn't actually happen. That was also, there was a command against that. But we can make it a more broad principle of not lying. So those are the 10 commandments, okay, that God gave the children of Israel, which then became the basis of Christian ethics and became the basis of, probably you could say, the basis of Islamic ethics and Jewish ethics. And then if you look at the Old Testament, you also see things like this: love your neighbor as yourself. So this was another, but Jesus also reiterates this in the New Testament. It's a little bit of a false narrative to say that this came just from Jesus. It actually came, you can find this, love your neighbor as yourself, in the Old Testament, the original writings. So anyway, so that gives you kind of a broad picture of what these kind of commands were that Christians felt like or feel like even today, need to follow. So some criticisms of Christian ethics include, first of all, what is God's will? And how do we know what God's will is? Okay, what does Warburton say about this? What do Christians say is God's will? How do they find out what God's will is?
Bible.
Right. So they go to a book that was written a long time ago, and it's called the Bible, Scriptures, and they look up in there and they try to figure out what God's will is. It said, so I'm trying to decide. Let's say I'm trying to decide, should I kill this person or not? And so then you look through the Bible, and it says you shouldn't kill. And okay, I won't kill anybody. Okay, so that's the basis. So it's based on the Bible. I'm being a little bit silly by saying it that way, but you can think of it somewhat in that sense. Now, I believe it's a little different than what Warburton is characterizing this as, but it is definitely true that the Bible is the basis of Christian ethics. It would be hard to argue otherwise. Okay, but what's wrong with making the Bible your basis for your ethics? What would be a problem with that? Okay, that could be one problem. It's from a different age. So why does it have any relevance for today, right? It's from another time. What else? What are some other problems? So in other words, very similar to what Yuxuan is saying. There should be a modern kind of set of laws, right? You wouldn't necessarily look to the Bible first. Maybe the Bible's the same as your laws, but you want to look at what the recent updated version of the law is. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Well, there's another, actually more fundamental problem than those. Those are problems that you guys are talking about, but there's maybe arguments that you could use for and against those. But what actually is kind of a problem is that the Bible is open to many interpretations, right? And that has something to do with what you're saying, Yuxuan, about it being an ancient book. But it's not because it's outdated per se. I mean, you can make that argument if you want, but it's more has to do with if anything is written down, even if I wrote it down yesterday or I wrote it down right now, if I write this down here, you're actually going to have some interpretation that you need to bring. Now, it's easy for you to ask me, what did you mean, Jesse, when you talked about this? Because you can ask me and I can give you an answer. But who do we go to when we have the Bible? We can't ask the authors. What did you mean when you wrote this? You don't have somebody to talk to about it. And so therefore, there's going to be, maybe Lydia's going to have one idea. When she reads the Bible, she has one idea. When I read the Bible, I have another idea. You have another idea. You have another idea. So how do we decide altogether that this means the same thing? So this is actually a problem of interpretation. Now, I believe there are some ways that we can resolve that conflict of interpretation. I think as you do study, as you actually make some actual real effort to understand the languages and the cultures of whatever time period you're studying, I think you can get closer to a understanding. But the problem is that most people aren't going to spend the time to do that. They're not going to spend the time to actually make the effort to make interpretation. So you're going to have a lot of people that read the Bible that are going to make very funny claims about what the Bible says, whereas the Bible might be saying something totally different, and some people are going to misinterpret the Bible. So that's an interesting problem, and it's an interesting criticism that we can actually interact with. What about killing from the perspective of the Bible? So there's some issues like that relate to this interpretation. So one is that you're told in the Bible you shall not kill. Well then, but what about in times where the Japanese invaded China and they're going to kill your mother, and you need to defend your mother, and so you shoot. Sorry, I hate to say it this way, but yeah, I'm just trying to make it relational. You shoot them, and then, so is that wrong to do that, to protect your mother, to kill somebody who's trying to attack your mother? and you have to defend her, and you kill the person. So you have these questions. So that's now I'm going to show you how actually this is a little bit of a straw man argument, because it's not. Yeah. Anyway, there's deeper things we can go into here. But just for now, these are some of the objections that say Warburton and maybe some others give about Christian ethics. And what is this Euthyphro dilemma? Do you remember? So Plato is the one who came up with this Euthyphro dilemma, and the Euthyphro dilemma is something that he formulated in one way, but basically others, like I think it was Leibniz, took it and changed it a little bit. So the idea behind it is, is right and wrong, is it defined by God? Does God define what's right and wrong? Or is there right and wrong, and then and God is going along with it? He's saying, he's agreeing with the right and wrong. So an example of this would be, actually, or can you guys give some examples of this? What would be an example of this? And how does this bring a less than desirable outcome? I guess that would be another question. So the first problem in the Euthyphro dilemma is if God defines everything, then it becomes arbitrary. He could define murder as good one time, he could define murder as wrong the next time. So it doesn't seem like there's any established reason for anything to be right or wrong. But if those things are already defined, then it minimizes God's greatness, that he's just following other principles that are out there, and it doesn't make him in control or in the power to make the decision. So we're going to revisit the Euthyphro dilemma to look at how there's some people who have responded to the Euthyphro objection and show how they maybe have resolved this problem. Mm-hmm. The other thing about Christian ethics, that I think this is the major objection that people are going to have, is that you have to first, if you're going to go along with Christian ethics or Judeo, any monotheistic ethics, you have to assume that God exists already, right? Like, what's the point in going along with these things if you don't agree that there's a God already that exists? You also have to assume that God is good, that there's goodness about him, to just go along. So if God is saying don't murder, and your only reason for not murdering is that there is a God, you have to assume that's a good thing because God is good. You see, so there's a kind of a step you have to make. So if you don't agree with God's existence or God's benevolence, then there's no reason for you to agree with Christian ethics in general. So, okay, so we have that to deal with, that it would be very hard to argue for the Christian ethics if you don't believe there's a God already behind that. So now you can look at that as a negative thing or a positive thing for Christian ethics. So the reason I would consider it a positive thing is that if there is a God, and if the Bible is correct, if you're arguing for Christian ethics, then people would have to have a very strong arguments why they would object to Christian ethics. You'd have to figure out, why would you then object to Christian ethics if these things are true? But if there isn't, then you could, which would be the negative, then you could just disregard Christian ethics. But either way, you're forced to consider the first classes that we discussed, the existence of God. If you're going to think about all the different types of ethics as plausible theories, then you need to consider God's existence. So you can see how that's such an important question when you're considering other things like ethics. It'll keep coming up. You'll keep running into this problem. So you have to resolve that question in your own mind before you can make a good evaluation of things like ethical theories. So in my opinion, this is what I kind of came up with, is that Warburton is providing a caricature of Christian ethics. What is a caricature? A caricature is taking maybe some facts about something and then, but not providing all of the information, not giving a very full description, and it often provides a distorted image of that person or of their ideas. So I think in many ways that's what Warburton is doing. Another thing is his objections that he brings up are mostly strawman arguments. They're not really based on things that actually Christian ethics are holding up. So a couple of examples of this are, why can't some moral questions have guiding principles, like so that killing is wrong, and then you have exceptional circumstances, like you would kill Hitler. To kill Hitler is right in order to stop him from killing others, right? So I think most Christians would believe that there are, and actually even in the Bible from the biblical perspective, if you read it closely, is that there are some general principles and then there's some exceptional circumstances. And okay, sorry. I think it's not under the mandate of the law. I can't see it from here on the screen because my video camera is covering it. He's not under the mandate of the law precisely because he is the moral law. So what Phaser is pointing out here is, you guys know the question about the chicken and the egg. What came first, the chicken or the egg, right? So this is to me an example of not a false dichotomy, but an unsolvable dichotomy. You can't really say either one. I mean, you can make arguments for both. And it's a false dichotomy, otherwise, that Euthyphro dilemma is pointing out, is that if you believe in this God that's just and good, his goodness comes out of just his existence. So in other words, you can have an argument that shows that he is this law, that it's not from him commanding it, but that it's one and the same thing. So this is one way to argue against the Euthyphro dilemma. All right, so let's go on to the next part. Christian ethics are not necessarily obligatory, duty-based. They're not just focused on this duty-based kind of system, and many people have actually tried to blend it with something that we'll be looking at later, virtue theory. The problem of God's existence and benevolence doesn't need to be solved if you agree to some universals regarding morality. So it's possible, this is an argument to say that maybe it's possible to go along with Christian ethics, even if you don't really believe there's a God. And then I would say, which is kind of different than what I said before, but that was more of a personal comment. This is more of a general statement. Christians believe that humans have a conscience and know what is right and wrong, even if they don't do what is right. So, in other words, there's this idea in the Bible also of a conscience, that everyone has some of these basic principles, has been ingrained in them just from their own DNA, so to speak. And that would be a Christian concept as well. Now, this is interesting. Holmes brings up, in any ethical system, you're going to have four basic things. First of all, you're going to have cases, and you can see I wrote these things up here as well. You're going to have rules, principles, and then bases. This word bases has two pronunciations, by the way, the little English trick here. This could be bases, if you have a base, like an army base, and you have many different bases, then it's pronounced bases. But when it's spelled like this, it can also be bases, which is on the basis. It's a plural for basis, which is an I right here. So bases. So cases are like, for example, if you ask the question, should I lie? In some situation, should I lie? Is lying right or wrong? What do you think? Lying is to lie, tell a lie. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It depends.
Okay, it depends. And so that's exactly what this is kind of saying. If it's to save somebody's life, is lying right? To save somebody's life. Like, let's say you're going to save your mother's life, so you tell a lie to save her life.
It's a good lie.
It could be a good lie, right? If she's a murderer and maybe it's not a good, if she's actually doing something evil,
It depends
and she needs to be, brought to
people
justice.
that you see is good or bad.
Right. So it's kind of a hard one, but these are cases. We can call these cases. I'm not going to give you an answer to this question, but it's a case. And that case, in any system, this is to say in any system, you have it based on some sort of rules. So, for example, in the Christian context, you have the Ten Commandments that I just talked about. So you might have these rules. Maybe in China, you have, just in modern China, you have rules that are based on the law, the modern law. And so that maybe that's what you feel like is what's ethical, are those rules. But those rules aren't the stopping point, actually. They were based on principles. To come up with these rules, these Ten Commandments, there were certain principles that are in operation that fed into these rules. And that would be the same in the US or in China or whatever. If you're creating laws or rules, there's something underneath that. There's some belief system that gives you some sort of laws or some sort of principles that then feed into those rules. And even for our own lives, we have certain principles that we're living by. Whether or not we even understand those principles or can talk about those principles, those are there to enable us to then make certain rules for our lives. And then those principles are based on a basis or bases, like, for example, God commands that, right? So, and maybe the bases for, for the laws in China are that, well, the government says that this is what is right and wrong. So that's what I'm gonna go with as my whole ethical system. So this is an interesting way to look at it, because I think you can take any ethical system and maybe break it down to this, right, on this level. So Holmes shows that principles are like, for example, you have love and justice. Love is defined as self-sacrifice. It's not defined as maybe just doing something that you enjoy or find some fulfillment in. It actually has to do with actually serving and caring for others. But as Holmes points out in here, he says that love without justice would be amorphous and lack direction. Justice without love would be uncaring and detached. So justice and love need to be a balanced system that kind of help each other stay in balance. There's another concept, there's several principles that we can derive from in Christian ethics, but one of them is shalom, which would be a just sort of peace. So peace that has justice behind it. A liberating peace that gives people freedom. And a peace that brings enjoyment, and a peace that honors God. So these are kind of the Judeo-Christian ethics principles. And then you have rules. So then you have things like you should not murder and so on and so forth. But there's exceptional cases to the rules. And one of them is like manslaughter. Do you guys know what manslaughter is? So if I intentionally, I've planned out how I'm going to kill this person, and I go out and I kill them, is that the same or different than if I'm driving down the road and somebody walks across the street and I didn't see them and I bumped into them and killed them? Is it the same or different? It's different, right? So somehow we know that. And the difference then, should they be treated, under the law, should they be treated the same way or differently? They probably should be treated differently. And that's basically what the Bible also points out, is that there's exceptional cases, maybe like self-defense, that you would kill somebody to protect yourself or to protect somebody else. And there's also manslaughter, and there's others as well. So there's this kind of idea that there are exceptional cases. But in general, murder is wrong. But that would be a rule. That's not a principle. It's not the basis. It's a rule. And then in the cases, maybe are some of these exceptional situations, or they're a standard situation. All right, so that just gives you a balanced kind of perspective, just so you can see that there's other ways to look at the Christian ethics besides just the way that Warburton suggests. Okay, so Kantian ethics. So what was a main question that Kant was interested in? Any suggestions? So the answer is, what is moral action? That's a summary of the main focus of Kant's research in ethics. So, Kantian ethics, you have motives, which are a sense of duty. They're the driving factor, and it's not a sense of gain. So you should not be interested in what you're going to get out of it. You should only be interested in the duty that you are obliged to fulfill. So, for example, giving money to the poor is not moral if given out of a sense of compassion or to gain status. It's only out of sense of duty that it is moral. So this is interesting, because I could kind of divide maybe a sense of compassion from gaining status. So sometimes people give money. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I know for sure in the United States, there's a lot of people who give money, and it gives them a kind of a status. And sometimes they get their name, like in the university, they gave money to the university, very generous, and they get their name, a little plaque with their name on it, and they gave this much money, and everybody gets to look at it and they go, oh, that guy's so good, he gave money, Or sometimes people will even simply give money to a beggar on the street because they want other people to see how good they're being by giving that money, right? So maybe that's a gaining status. Now, that seems very different to me. That seems very different than maybe nobody knows I'm giving money, but I actually really feel bad for this person, and so I'm giving them money. That's compassion. I'm using compassion. But for Kant, that wasn't appropriate. He could say it's not a bad thing that you did, but he wouldn't say it's a truly moral action. The truly moral action is, I am obliged to give money in this situation because it's the right thing to do. So it's a little bit circular, but that's how he saw things. Now, motives were more important than actions or consequences. So he said, you have to look at the heart of a person. You don't just look at what they do. And this is also a Christian idea. If you read in the Old Testament and New Testament, the motives are what matters, not just the do. And that's where you get the ought implies can. Ought is what you're supposed to do, and that is what gives you what you can and can't do. So an example of this, if you're saving a drowning child, but the child accidentally drowns, is it moral or not? According to Kant. It's a moral action. Why is that? Why is it a moral action? Right, because you wanted him to be saved, or he or she to be saved. You had a motive. Your motive was a correct motive. So the outcome doesn't matter as much as the motive. What does Kant mean? He uses a phrase or a term called a maxim. What to him is the maxim, or a maxim? Exactly, word for word, Warburton there. The general principle underlying the action. Okay, so again, what does that mean? Well, it's very similar to motive, right? Because what would be the general principle that you have? Well, it's a little different from motive, because obviously a principle is not necessarily a motive, but your motive would be derived from that general principle. So what are some examples of this? So which one of these questions or statements, maxims, these are all maxims right here, guys. Each of these three are maxims. Which one of them would Kant call ethical? The first one is always help those in need. If you expect, you will be rewarded for your troubles. The second one, always help those in need when you experience a feeling of compassion. And 3, always help those in need because it is your duty to do so. Which one is Kant's idea of what would be ethical?
Third one.
The third one. That's correct. And why is that so? Why is it the third one?
Because I think the third one is the most general.
The third one's the most general, but there's also something else about the third one that can tell us exactly why. Right? The duty. It's all about duty. For Kant, it was all about duty. So, so that's the only maxim in these 3 that Kant would call ethical. If you help somebody with a feeling of compassion, or if you help somebody because you were going to be rewarded, same as we said before, those are not ethical. What are categorical imperatives? Kant uses this kind of fancy term to talk about something. What does it mean, categorical imperative? So we have certain imperatives or duties, commands, to act in a certain way. Are these absolute and unconditional? Oh, I think they're absolute and unconditional from Kant's perspective. And what are some of these commands that Kant comes up with? Yeah, see, these are some of them. You can look at the rest of them in Warburton, but I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. What is the difference between categorical duties and hypothetical ones? So he came up with categorical duties, which are categorical imperatives, basically. And then there's hypothetical duties, if you had a hypothetical duty. So what would be the difference between these two things? Right. So a hypothetical one would be like, if you want to be respected, then you shouldn't kill other people. Yeah. And the duty-based one, or categorical duties, are, you just shouldn't kill somebody because it's just part of this absolute unconditional maxim or categorical imperative. It isn't a categorical imperative. So basically, it's a fancy way of talking about some abstract truths that exist that none of us have to necessarily come up with. So how do these truths get arrived at? Like, how do we actually test, that that murder and stealing and these kinds of things are wrong? Well, what Kant comes up with is you should be able to take a categorical. The way to know that it's a categorical imperative is it should be universal. So it should be you have it be a universal principle. And so he comes up with this term universalizability, so that you should be able to universalize some sort of maxim. If you can universalize the maxim, then it's part of the categorical imperative. Okay, so universalizability. What is that principle? What's the principle? And I give it right here, actually. You don't even have to look in your book. Act only on maxims which you can at the same time rationally want to be universal laws. So if you want it to be that in all situations it's not good to murder, then we can call that a universal or a categorical imperative. If it's not, if it's only, in China we shouldn't murder people, but anywhere else you can murder people, then this isn't something that we would call a universalized maxim, and therefore it should not be a categorical imperative. So this is based a lot on, in the New Testament, we have something that's called the Golden Rule, which is do unto others as you would want them to do to you. And what Kant has done is he's shown that there's both a means and an end. So do you guys understand this concept of means and end? Means is something that you do to achieve something, and then end is what you've achieved, the goal that you've arrived at. So he makes a distinction, and he says, when we treat people a certain way, we shouldn't treat them as means. We need to treat them as ends. In other words, we need to treat them not according to, that if I do this and then this and that, I get some sort of outcome, but rather look at the whole person and try to treat them fairly based on who they are. And then you can think about maybe the other things that have to do with how you treat them. And so you start with the whole person first. So this is actually a very interesting concept, and you try to treat them according to these universalized maxims and categorical imperatives. So some criticisms of Kantian ethics are that they're just empty. They're just a framework, and there isn't any practical guidance. But the question is this really empty? Do you guys think that Kant's ideas don't actually provide some sort of practical guidance? Conflicts of duty, I think, would be a more fair criticism. When you look at Kant and you try to figure out, now, should I tell the truth or should I protect my friends? That you're not going to have, with these universal maxims and with the categorical imperatives, you're not going to be able to distinguish what duty you have when you have them. So, for example, in this example of telling the truth or protecting your friend, what should you do? You have a duty to be loyal to your friend, but then you also, which might be a universal, we could find a universal for that. And we can also universalize telling the truth. But when those things come together and you have to choose between protecting your friend or telling the truth, you're going to have a conflict there. And Kant doesn't give us any guidance for something like this. Okay, and so what you end up with is absurd outcomes, where you're going to maybe do something that would be very absurd as a result of this kind of conflict. Another thing that's a criticism that we could level at Kantian ethics is downplaying the role of emotions, like compassion. We mentioned this earlier when we looked at the 3 different scenarios in which one Kant would agree with. It seems like there is at least an argument that can be made for being compassionate, and that being a very ethical way of behaving. And so just because, like you said, you could have the feeling that, okay, this is going to be, I'm going to do this and it's going to be very rewarding for me because I'm being compassionate, and that makes me feel good because I'm compassionate. I don't think there is always a situation that's going to happen. Sometimes you're going to act out of compassion without really much thought of your own self, and that has to be explained, has to be accounted for, and it seems awfully narrow to be able to just rule out all compassion and just base things on duty. Then there's this overemphasis on the intentions. And so for example, if you have a situation where somebody is just being plain stupid, like they're driving recklessly, not because they did anything wrong, but because they're actually stupid when they're driving. They're not competent. They're not good at driving, and they do things like hitting somebody. So we should probably have some judgment on the intelligence and the competence of somebody, not on their basic intelligence, but on what we would expect people to learn in order to fulfill certain functions in society. If you are training to be a computer programmer, but you, instead of studying really hard in school, you don't learn everything, and then you go do your job, and then you create a program that ends up destroying the company that you work for, or you make some mistake and it causes people problems and grief, then you should be held responsible for that. And we can't say that that's not a unethical choice that you've made. And so Kant actually doesn't really have a way to deal with this, because he's only talking about your intentions. You were really intending to be a good student. You were really intending to do a good job in your computer programming, or you were really intending to be a great driver and be really careful. But if you didn't learn the things that you needed to learn, shouldn't that be taken into consideration in ethical questions? So these are things to also consider. We're going to take a break, and then we'll talk about consequentialism. Now we'll talk about consequentialism. So consequentialism is action that is judged on the result and not the intent. So is this the same as Kantian ethics, or different? But actually fundamentally it's different in this idea of the intent is not important. Whereas Kant put everything on the intent, right? Motive and intent are kind of the same thing. So in a sense, consequential theories are the exact opposite of the Kantian ethics. Now, it's not necessarily opposite of all duty-based ethics, because not all duty-based ethics are based on motives. Some duty-based ethics might have other, ideas, but they're all duty-based. But this major difference really conflicts with Kant. So Kant's idea is that you have to have the right motive to have the right ethics. But this consequentialism thinks that no, it's about whatever results you get. It's the result that you get that determines whether or not the action was right or wrong. Does that make sense? Okay, what are the consequentialist theories that are discussed, at least in Warburton? There's 3 right here. Utilitarianism, negative utilitarianism, and rule utilitarianism. And we're going to look at each of these. First of all, just talking about utilitarianism, we have 2 main philosophers that talked about these. One is Jeremy Bentham, and both of them are from primarily the 19th century, although Bentham is also part of the 18th century, and you also have John Stuart Mill. Bentham is actually, one thing that is interesting and maybe fruitful from his perspective was that he brought in animals into discussion about ethics. So whether or not you agree with utilitarianism, we can all agree that he actually is one of the first, at least in the Western, more intellectual, from the intellectual tradition, that he actually brought in animals into the discussion. So we're going to look at a little bit at what both of these men had to say and how they shaped this concept that we can call utilitarianism. So utilitarianism belongs to something that we can call hedonism. Now, hedonism goes way back to the Greeks. So yeah, the ultimate aim of human activity is happiness. This is a summary of what hedonism is. So it's based on how much pleasure, how much happiness you get from something. And that should be the basis for what we decide in life. So this is a question we will address in this section. How is good defined by a utilitarian? That's called the greatest happiness principle, or the principle of utility. Whatever brings about the greatest total happiness is what's good. So it's a constant calculation. Is what I'm doing causing less happiness or more happiness? More happiness would be with more people. The more people that are happy, then the better off. Even if one person has to suffer, if more people are happy, then that's good. So it's the greatest balance of happiness, bringing the most happiness or most happiness over unhappiness. So the possible consequences, nothing can be predicted with absolute certainty. You can't know for sure what the outcome is. And so you can still make you can come up with some ideas of what's going to be the most happy, but you might not be able to be absolutely sure. One nice thing I said as earlier with utilitarian perspectives is they had a clear method for actually including animals into the scheme. So what are some criticisms? Well, first of all, it's difficult to calculate. As I mentioned earlier, you're making all kinds of calculations. How do you make those calculations? How do you decide if someone or something has more pleasure and less pain? How do you make a total scale of that? We have how many billion people? 8 billion people on the planet now, close to 8 billion, if not already 8 billion. If you take all of we have to calculate for every action that could possibly affect the whole world. How do you calculate out of 8 billion people? Is it, and how would you come up with the scale? Do you have to take a survey every time? Do we have to come up with some sort of metric that allows us to know? Maybe you have, and then you have to come up with a percentage. So if it's 51% of those 8 billion people are happier in this situation, then we can decide that this is good. If not, then we decide that that thing is bad. It seems like a very complicated way to allow for, to come up with good solutions and moral solutions. The other problem is that it leads to absurd conclusions. So, for example, if pleasure and pain are the basis of morality, then the claims of a sadist could be justified. I mentioned that earlier. People also differ so much in what makes them happy. So you're going to constantly have conflicts between what makes one person happy and another thing that makes a person happy. So animals, it also makes it problematic to include animals, because then how do we calculate? We can't talk to animals. We don't know if their pleasure or pain is being increased or decreased by certain actions that we do. We assume that they are being increased, but we can't know for sure, right? When we feed them maybe certain foods, or which food do I feed my cat? Maybe this food is better for them. Now the people that are saying, the advertisers say now you have to use this food, and so I use that food. But maybe that's worse. Maybe that's a trick from the advertisement people. So how do you make all these kind of moral decisions if you include animals into your ethics? So Mill had some correctional ideas to Bentham. So Bentham kind of came up with some of the first ideas. Mill later on said, okay, well, what there are higher and lower pleasures. So higher are all the intellectual pleasures, and lower are physical pleasures. So his idea is better to be sad and smart than a happy fool. Okay, but the problem with this kind of mentality and attitude is it brings a bit of an elitism. That basically, unless you're an intellectual, he was more of an academic type, and he was writing books and articles and stuff like that. And maybe as an intellectual, I can kind of agree to this, but a lot of people aren't going to be intellectuals. A lot of people are going to do other jobs. And so that kind of puts them off to the side and says, well, you're not really enjoying the most important pleasures in life. And so it kind of marginalizes a whole sections of society. It also does not, the problem with utilitarianism is it does not consider the long-term effects of action. So for example, some people will punish their child by hitting them. Now I think that's completely wrong, but in a utilitarian concept, you might hit a child to prevent them from doing something that would be, in the short term, be a bad thing for them. So for example, let's say they are reaching out to touch, the stove, and they're going to burn themselves, and then you say, "Don't do that," and they do it, and they hurt themselves. So not only do you, see that they've hurt themselves, and maybe they didn't learn their lesson from that, but maybe you also hit their hand. Okay. Now, in the short term, maybe what you did was good. You kind of reinforced some sort of lesson for them, and that makes them kind of, shocked. But in the long term, there could be some psychological effects to treating a child that way. If you have used physical or corporal punishment, maybe later in life, when they're 20 and they're 30 years old, those things will be things that they will have to deal with, and they'll have to go to a psychologist or a counselor and talk about those things. So utilitarianism has no way of talking about the long-term effects. It really is looking at a lot of the short-term effects of the problems. So it justifies traditionally immoral actions. If killing an innocent person will result in less crime, is that killing right? Actually, there's a question I can ask to you as a class. What do you think of that? maybe a utilitarian wouldn't actually put it in those words. Like they wouldn't say, oh, I can kill an innocent person, and that's going to help society, so therefore it's right. They still, the logical conclusion of their system would mean that you could kill an innocent person as long as it caused more good. As long as the outcome was more good, then what you do to an innocent person doesn't really matter. That's a logical conclusion of utilitarianism.
What about the train experiment?
Okay, so yeah, and then I mentioned before, if you secretly add a drug to water and it makes people happy without adverse effects, is it right? Does that make it right? So if you add some drug to the water and it makes people happy, right, and it doesn't cause any problems to them, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Bad.
Why? Okay, but what if it doesn't affect the children? It's okay. It doesn't actually hurt them in any way. No hurt, just makes people more happy. Okay, so maybe this is why it's not right. Because it seems like it violates people's ability to choose. Is that correct? Like, would you feel that? It seems like people should have the right to choose. Somehow inside of us, we feel that there should be a right to choose whether or not I take something into my body. And if somebody is secretly doing it to us, even if it's not causing any harm, it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. So, but the problem with utilitarianism, this is to talk about, not so much to talk about these examples as much as it's to look at the utilitarian theory, is that it doesn't tell us, it can't tell us that this is wrong, if this action is wrong. So in these two examples, maybe you agree with it. Maybe you think it's fine to kill an innocent person to justify reducing crime. But you'll only be able to explain it from this utilitarian perspective. From other people's perspectives who would say that's wrong, it's really hard to convince them that by using an innocent person that's a good thing. And again, about the happiness thing as well, about the drugs making people happier. Again, it's coming from a point of view that doesn't seem plausible. At some point, it seems like these are totally absurd predictions that we would ever want this to be the way that we actually live our lives and run society. So some criticisms of utilitarianism comes from one scholar by the name of Robert Nozick. And Robert Nozick came up with this idea of the experience machine. And what the experience machine is, if you were plugged into a machine, okay, and this machine is kind of like the Matrix, okay? But there's no adverse effects. Nothing bad is actually going to happen to you, okay? But you have the choice. You can choose to be plugged into a machine, and you will only experience pleasure all the time, okay? And you just whatever. You can choose different kinds of pleasure. You can choose varieties of pleasure. It doesn't have to be the same thing. You'd never get bored. You'd have just a good time the entire time. Would you choose that, or would you choose the life we have now? Would you rather be plugged into an experience machine that causes only pleasure and nice feelings and good feelings, or would you rather just live a normal life like we live now? I'm glad you're different because it helps show that there are some people that maybe would. Most people actually, from his perspective, now I don't know if this has ever been widely studied, so this would be a very interesting study. If you guys decide to go on to graduate school and you want to study philosophy, this would be actually a very interesting study, is to see how many people would be like Lydia and how many people would be like Yuxuan and Yuan. Because then you can kind of tell. But from what his claim is, and this resonates with me, is most people don't want to join the machine. Most people would not want to join that machine because most people want to still be in control. Most people want some sort of control over their life.
Blue pills.
Blue pill. So yeah, because that's from the Matrix. If you haven't seen the Matrix, then you want the red pill or the blue pill. So most people aren't, even though I know if I join the machine, I can be tricked into thinking that I'm in control of my life. The reality is I won't be in control of my life. So for most people, that's enough. What are your reasons? It's interesting to me that there is different views of this, and one of them is, have you guys heard of the term utopia? Utopia. So utopia is the idea of a perfect society. That maybe someday we can achieve as humans, a society where nobody hurts each other. Yeah. And so this is also a reflection of another concept, which goes even further in religion, which is an idea that after you die, you go to a heaven, which would be like being plugged into this machine in a sense, like that you actually will live a life that is without pain. So I wonder if there's some aspect of it, and it just shows that maybe some of us actually want, maybe not in this life, but we want maybe in our next life, there to be a place. We want there to be a place where there's no pain and suffering. So it kind of, maybe it doesn't answer the question as a criticism of utilitarianism, but it's a very interesting question to think about, is why is there a desire, at least in some humans, to have no pain. Thomas More wrote a book on utopia, and there's of course been a lot of other people who've written about this. Bentham was convinced that methods don't matter, only the results matter, and this is very problematic, I think, when we start to think about it. If you just are focusing on the results, you can end up having lots of justification for your means. So have you heard this concept? The ends justifies the means. So that means you can use whatever methods as long as you get the very end result is good. So if you can achieve utopia, then but you have to kill a lot of people to get to utopia, then it's okay, as long as the end result is utopia. So I think part of the problem of this is the unpredictable nature of the future. How can we say what our actions are doing now will guarantee a future that we envision as good? So this is, again, this is a problem of utilitarianism as a fundamental idea, structure behind ethics. Okay, so again, another criticism of utilitarianism is how you can deal with promises. So most of us would say, let's say you owe Yuxuan 100 kwai, okay? Most of us would say the right thing to do is to pay back Yuxuan, right? You at some point you must pay him back, unless he says to you, "Don't worry about it. You don't owe me money." But if you owe him money, and maybe it's a business situation, and it's 100 kwai, 100,000 kwai, doesn't matter what the amount is. It's a business. You borrow the money. You need to pay it back. Now, what if Yuxuan has some mental problem? Goes to the hospital. He wakes up. He cannot remember that he loaned you $100,000. Okay, now he cannot remember, and you will never remember. And let's just say he will never find out. Is it wrong that you don't pay him back, or should you still pay him back?
I still pay him back.
Okay.
It is wrong that
if you don't pay him back. Okay, so but in utilitarianism, if you use a utilitarian perspective, if you forgot he owes you the money, it's not causing him pain, right? Because we're talking about pain and pleasure. There's no pain, and there's more pleasure for you.
Yeah.
So therefore, not paying him back would be the right thing to do. So you see, so this helps you understand the logical consequences of utilitarianism as an idea. It's not to say that maybe there's some situations that utilitarianism could solve some problems, but it's showing that it's problematic as an overall theory. And that's what we're trying to address here, is the overall theories. Okay, let's look at some other ones. There's negative utilitarianism. So negative utilitarianism, instead of trying to cause the most happiness, it tries to reduce suffering. It tries to cause the least amount of suffering. So it produces the least amount, another way to say this is the least amount of unhappiness. So you don't want to make people unhappy. And this is very similar, I found. Maybe you guys can suggest otherwise. I think it's very similar to Buddhist thought. Because in Buddhist, in Buddhist thinking, everything is suffering. Everything is suffering. And it's all caused by our desire. So we have desire, and desire causes suffering. So we try to eliminate desire. If we eliminate desire, we will eliminate suffering. So it's kind of a negative view of reality. But we have to eliminate suffering. The way to eliminate suffering is to eliminate desire. So the goal is not to make people happy in Buddhism. The goal is to take away your suffering. So the criticisms of negative utilitarianism is that it's, what if, okay, I'll give you a scenario. You can tell me what you think. Let's say we could find a way to painlessly get rid of all living things. Just painlessly get rid of all, because there's so much suffering, right? There's lots of suffering, we have to admit. In the world, there's lots of suffering. So why not solve the problem by painlessly, like maybe an atomic bomb? We can, because you die very fast, instantaneous. We can have everything die, right? Then you eliminate all suffering. So why not? Why not do that? Why can't we just eliminate all life? Because that would cause, for Buddhists, that would be great, because then there's no more suffering.
Because if you destruct all of the life, like, of course, the suffering will be destructed too, but also all of the people that make you happy, like your happiness, your motivation, something like that, will also be destructed, eliminated.
Yeah, but from a negative utilitarian, I shouldn't say Buddhist, because it's actually, maybe Buddhists would disagree with that, so that might be unfair, but at least from a negative utilitarian perspective, you're causing the least amount of suffering. Because that other suffering is going to continue. So if we end all suffering, then we have accomplished the goals of negative utilitarianism, right?
Yeah.
What I'm trying to show is that there's a problem now, right? Because we can't argue against why wouldn't we just let all life be destroyed. We have no argument against that if we take a negative utilitarian perspective. Okay, here's another one, and then we'll take a break. We have rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism adopts a deontological ethical rules to utilitarianism. So deontological meaning that it's based on the being of an individual or being of the society, and it derives its meaning from that. And so the problem, though, with the rule-based utilitarianism is that there becomes a conflict between the rules and individual cases that go against the rule, but align with your basic moral sympathies. So just to repeat, an example of this would be Yuen promising Lydia to bring her a teddy bear, but instead, what he ends up bringing is a baby cat. But actually, secretly inside, Lydia would love to have this baby kitten. Okay, so in a rule-based utilitarianism, you've already come up with a rule, perhaps, that you should never break your promises. So you just broke your promise. You did not bring the teddy bear that you promised, but you actually brought something better to her, a baby cat. And so it seems absurd to say that you did something immoral by breaking your promise, because you actually brought something that she likes even better, even though you did break, technically, you broke your promise. So rule-based utilitarianism can't solve the underlying problems of utilitarianism. Aristotle was the first to come up with what we call virtue theory, and it's kind of had a revival in recent years. People have been looking at what Aristotle had to say about ethics, and this is called a neo-Aristotelianism. And it's not focused. What's interesting about virtue theory is it's not focused on individual actions, but actually the entire life of a person and the character of a person. And this is focused then in a way that would cultivate or bring out the virtues in a person, and these virtues then cause people to flourish, cause human flourishing in general. So you guys see the difference in the focus? So in earlier theories, we were looking a lot at the actions, and so then you have a lot of questions. Like you have the question, you have the question of the trains. English job, yeah. You have the question of the train. When you look at individual actions, you have the question of the trains. When you look at the life of the whole person, a virtue theorist, maybe they wouldn't focus so much on these things, okay? Or on the cases, or like those questions about, what do you do in this situation, what do you do in that? Instead, you focus more on maybe the bases and especially the principles that guide the entire person's lives. And then as you do that, you might have these different things, and that would affect the cases, obviously. But it seems to be looking at the problem in a different way than, say, the duty-based theories and the consequentialist theories, which tend to focus a lot on the individual actions. So flourishing is an important word here. In Greek, it comes from the Greek eudaimonia, could be translated as happiness, but really it's more than that. It has to do with certain ways of living that produce a flourishing. And what is flourishing? Well, flourishing is when somebody lives a good life, when their entire life is lived well, from birth to death, trying to find ways to live that entire life in a good way. So again, then you need to define, well, what is good, right? So what is virtue, though? So they talk about developing virtues. The key to living this good life would be to develop virtues. So what is virtue, according to the virtue theorists? According to Warburton, what virtue to the virtue theorists is, it's a pattern of behavior and feeling. So this is important because there isn't a separation so much between the behavior and the feeling. Now, if you remember back to Kant, was feeling part of the calculation in categorical imperatives? No, Kant was focused primarily on what? The motive, the intention, what would cause the underlying basis for choosing a right and wrong. So, but in this situation, so emotions were not taken into consideration for Kant. But in virtue theory, it's the behavior, but it's also the feeling. It's a tendency to act, desire, and feel in particular ways in appropriate situations. So act, your actual behavior outside, your desire, so deep down inside what you want, and also the feelings that you have about that. All of these things are taken in consideration when we're discussing a virtue. Intelligent judgment is part of the process. It's not just having a knee-jerk reaction to each situation. So somebody does something wrong to me, and so to get justice, I just automatically do something back. But rather, the question, you have an intelligent judgment. You spend time thinking about what would be the right response in this situation. So in the Good Samaritan story, did we discuss the Good Samaritan story? Probably not. So do you guys know what the Good Samaritan story is? This is a classic part of Western culture because it came through the teaching of Jesus. And what it talked about was one day there was a man who was robbed. He was on a highway, and some people came, robbed him. They jumped on top of him, and they beat him. And he left him on the side of the road. They took all his money, they took all his clothes, they took everything. And they beat him. He was almost dead, but he was on the side of the road laying there. And one day, or not one day, but that same day, later on, a priest came by, so a religious person came by, and he didn't help him. And then another person came by who was also like a very upstanding citizen or like very kind of religious person, and he also didn't help him. But then finally, his enemy, somebody who's from a different tribe, so the man was a Jew, and from a different tribe, which we call the Samaritans, which the Samaritans and the Jews did not get along. But this guy, who was kind of an enemy, he came and he helped the man who was bleeding and dying on the side of the road. He gave him clothing, and he took him and kind of treated his wounds, and then he took him to an inn or somewhere he could rest. The man could rest and recover, and he paid his money, and he even said paid in advance, and he said, I'll come back and even pay more if there needs to be. So Jesus says, which person was the one who was the righteous one, the one who did the right actions? Well, obviously it's the man who was the good Samaritan, the man who came and helped the Jew that was dying on the side of the road. And so this story has been called the Good Samaritan. So oftentimes, if you do something good, like in America or in the West, they'll say, oh, you're being a good Samaritan. And so that's where that comes from. So it's good to know about. But in the Good Samaritan story, a virtue theorist would say that the man that was a good Samaritan was acting both out of a feeling of compassion and an act of compassion. So Kant would say it's only the moral obligation that made that action right. If he came from the duty, he was doing this out of duty, then his action was correct. Virtue theorists would say it's both the feeling and the act. A utilitarian would say with the Good Samaritan, it's only the greatest happiness. If the Jew who is dying on the side of the road is more happy as a result, and the Good Samaritan is more happy, and everybody is more happy than less happy, then the ultimate goal has been achieved and it's a moral action. So these are different ways of looking at the story from each of those ethical perspectives. So anything that's done in self-benefit for a virtue theorist is not virtuous. Virtues include things like generosity, courage, and these things are needed. Generosity and courage are needed to live well, to have a good life. So a virtuous person harmonizes all virtues also. There isn't one virtue that's more important than another. You take all of the virtues, you put them together, and that's what gives you. One more thing is that it assumes a stability of characteristics. So a generous person would have to be generous in every circumstance, not in just some circumstances. And that, of course, maybe is hard to actually ever achieve. That I don't know if there's any person who's consistently generous in every circumstance throughout their entire life, right? Maybe that's more of an ideal than it is a reality. Okay, here's some responses that I came up with to the criticism of virtue theory. First of all, people are more generous outside. One of the criticisms was that people are more generous outside of a bakery than a hardware store, so this is situational. That everything that we actually do is based on some sort of situation we're found in. But what about ideals? If there is an ideal that you are generous, then those ideals would still be valid, whether or not, sometimes I'm more generous than other times, that the circumstances. So it's really a battle of whether you believe in ideals or if you don't believe in ideals. Or like it's kind of the realism and nominalism debate again. Even though in horrible circumstances humans tend to behave horribly, there are examples of humans overcoming basic instincts in horrible circumstances and display the virtues of generosity, compassion, and courage. So, I can think of examples where people have been heroic, and despite them almost dying, instead of doing a bad thing to get something for themselves, they'll actually give to people who other people besides themselves. So we do find this in human beings, and so I don't think that it's all determined by our circumstances. The next topic we should discuss is applied ethics. Applied ethics is when you're just trying to you're trying to solve various problems. Like, for example, is abortion right? Is euthanasia correct? What about capital punishment? So all of these things are real issues that are happening right now, and it's trying to decide if these are good or bad. Or what about experiments, with cloning, or these different types of biological questions. Right now, the big question is AI. Is it ethical to keep developing artificial intelligence, these kinds of things? So applied ethics tries to answer these problems. And as we will see, it doesn't necessarily give you an easy answer, but it does provide a framework and some language to be able to actually discuss this. So euthanasia is also called mercy killing. There's different reasons why people do it. They might say, well, this person is really, really old, and so it's better if they are not alive than alive. Other times people can be in extreme pain, and they'd rather be dead than alive. What do you think? Is euthanasia, which is a decision to kill somebody or to kill yourself, do you think this is good or a bad thing? So there's three kinds of euthanasia, right? There's voluntary euthanasia, so that's the kind where your mother agrees to it. Okay, or it doesn't have to be your mother, it can be any person. They agree to what is called assisted suicide. They request it, and it's voluntarily from their own decision. There's two other types. There's involuntary euthanasia, which that person does not decide. Somebody else decides for them, and they decide when they could decide. So it's not like they didn't have a choice. It's just they're not given a choice. And then there's non-voluntary euthanasia. Non-voluntary euthanasia is when that person cannot make a choice. So obviously there's circumstances where somebody's brain is no longer functioning properly, you cannot get a response from the person, and maybe they're on a life support, and at some point they're in a coma or something for years and years and years, and you decide then to pull the plug to the machine, so to speak, and let the person die. So that would be in a situation of non-voluntary. Now, but voluntary euthanasia is what we're going to look at next. And that's where I can decide when I want to die. So let's just ask a question there. What if right now I say, I would like to die, okay? So can you guys help me to die? What about if I have some really bad disease and I'm almost about to die, but I'm in so much pain, and there's some sort of like maybe needle with a drug that will make me die if you just put it in.
Just do it.
But you can do it by yourself.
Yeah, but what if I don't? Maybe I'm afraid, and I think, okay, the only way I can do it, or maybe I can't actually physically reach it. There's no way I can reach it. There's nothing I can do. I can only move my head, maybe breathe. Then would you do it?
Yes.
You also wouldn't do it. What about you? Would you do it? I think so. I think you, yes, you.
Where do you use the kill me?
You must hear me first say,
Yeah.
please kill me.
And
Okay.
some institutions have this.
Yeah, some institutions have this thing. So, okay, this is the thing we're talking about. This is the problem. This is the problem that we're talking about. Now, let's look at this problem with each of the theories. So far, we've discussed several different theories, right? And let's look at some different responses. Here's, first of all, the Christian response. So the Christian response is actually problematic because there's two teachings that kind of conflict. One is thou shalt not kill. So you shouldn't murder anytime, like what you're saying. You should never, there's never a time that I would kill you. It's not for me to decide in that situation. However, there's another principle that Jesus teaches to love your neighbor as yourself. So if you were in that situation and you wanted help to die, it would be the most loving thing then to also expect that that person would want that, and that would be a way to show love. However, I think there's a problem with making these two things in opposition to each other. I don't think they're necessarily in opposition to each other. I think, anyways, in any case, it becomes very complicated because there are moments also like this. Say the person has signed in their will before they go unconscious. They say, if I do not recover, if my brain has been damaged, and so on and so forth, please pull off the plug. In the machine that's keeping me alive, you pull the plug, and then I will die. So in that situation, I think some Christians would say, no, that's good, because the only thing that's keeping them alive is a machine. Okay, so it's a little different than the scenario where I'm saying, please put the drug into my arm, right? Because I still can live, even though it's in a lot of pain. But as somebody who can't necessarily live without a machine, maybe sometimes pulling the plug or something like this would be admissible. But in any case, the Christian response is complicated. It doesn't necessarily give us a clear answer on all the situations of voluntary euthanasia. Maybe it will give you an answer on some of them, but then on others it will say, no, it's wrong to do that. Kantian ethics could also be used for and against. How could you use Kantian ethics for voluntary euthanasia, and how can you use it against? So first, for Kantian ethics or Kantian ethics for voluntary euthanasia. What would be your reasons from a Kantian perspective? So think about duty and think about motivation. Okay, your motivation is that you want to help them, but actually that is actually an anti-duty thing. So in that situation, you would have to say Kant would be against, even though you want to do it, you have a feelings towards it, your duty is that you shouldn't do it. Okay, so that would be an argument from Kant against doing euthanasia. But what would be an argument using Kant's perspective for euthanasia? So an argument for Kant would be that Kant wants to treat people as ends, not just as means, and therefore what a person wants is very important, right? And so one of your duties might be to treat people as they want to be treated. So it's a conflict so it's actually almost the same conflict as the Christian response. One is that you have this principle, you shouldn't murder, but then you also have a principle of treating people as they want to be treated. And so there's a conflict there. What about utilitarian ethics? What are the pros and cons from a utilitarian point of view? So from a utilitarian perspective, the pro would be if this is going to bring overall happiness, then we should, decide to go ahead and go through the voluntary euthanasia. But if it's not, then you can argue against doing euthanasia. So it's not so much based on the duties, obviously, but it's more based on what's going to bring overall happiness. And again, it becomes difficult to calculate, and you can argue both ways with a utilitarian perspective. Okay, here is one question that has to be thought of with voluntary euthanasia, is that some people say, well, if we allow voluntary euthanasia to exist, so if you allow basically, at what point is there a cutoff for somebody just to commit suicide? So is it right for people to commit suicide? Actually, that's a good question to begin with, even if it's not having to do with the end of your life, but at any point in your life, is it good or is it right to allow people to make the decision to kill themselves? The main thing behind applied ethics is looking at each individual case and trying to make decisions based on rational kinds of objective, as much as you can, points of view. The other question, though, is going from, now we just talked about, difference between suicide and voluntary euthanasia, but what about this problem? Could voluntary euthanasia lead to involuntary euthanasia? So if you allow this kind of thing, so you're allowing people to, so a 7 or 8 year old is in a lot of pain because they're dying of a terminal cancer, and you allow him to decide to be euthanized, do you allow other people to make the decision for him? Or her? Would you allow somebody else?
Just parent.
Just the parents. Okay. So this is a question then, you can see then now that you've allowed the parents to make the decision to kill their child, technically, at what point will this eventually lead to there being more people doing the euthanasia, involuntary euthanasia, without people, deciding that that's what they want? Will that lead to that? So this is something that people have talked about. I don't think we're going to resolve this here, but some people are trying to say, well, if we allow involuntary euthanasia, eventually it could lead to, or if we allow voluntary euthanasia, eventually it could lead to involuntary euthanasia. I'm not sure if that really is the logical consequence, but it's something to think about. It's something to be kind of like, I guess, concerned about. Okay, virtue theory is sensitive to a particular case. So the way that virtue theory would apply this is similar to what we were talking about. You would look like at each case scenario. So actually, I think what we just kind of came to a conclusion it looked like was it's more about each case, given the case and what's going on in that case, than it is about making a general principle about it. So these situations, we can't make a general principle. We really have to look at each case. How much pain is the person in? What kind of disease do they have? How old are they? These are maybe going to be choices that we make on a case-by-case basis. The conflict, so there's a conflict between the virtues of justice and charity. And this is something that I think this came from my reading of Holmes. And so that justice, you want to see, or no, this might have been in our reading here, is that justice is that you want to see the right thing done. And charity is that you want things to have the love, and to see that love is the basis of things, and that love is self-sacrificing and self-giving, and that there's goodness that is promoted. But actually, as Holmes has said, both of them need each other. Justice and love, justice and charity, they balance each other out and make things better. Okay, so applied ethics. There's no easy answers. Obviously, technology and medical advances add to our applied ethical questions. And I like how Warburton says this here, is that philosophers can be good at spotting reasoning errors in such discussions, errors that turn on logical rather than moral points. But the fact remains that ethical decisions are the most difficult and the most important that we make. They're the most difficult questions and the most important questions. And the responsibility for our choices ultimately rests with each one of us. Last thing we're going to talk about before we end class today is ethics and meta-ethics. So what are first-order questions when we're talking about ethics? Oh, meta means above and over. Yeah, it's like the questions that kind of go over all of ethics. These are first-order questions. How should we behave, right? Specific situations. It's more dealing with the cases and maybe the rules. Second-order questions have to do with definitions and status of ethical theories. It's thinking of what is the meaning of right. What is right? How do we define right, and what's the basis for right? So principles and bases, probably more, that it has to do with. So these would be more like first-order questions. These would be second-order questions. There's different theories of how to address second-order questions. And each of these theories are what we call meta-ethics. They're kind of the greater overall arching conditions that we might consider. These are just three of them. I would say that there are some maybe virtue theory related kinds of meta-ethical approaches as well as Christian meta-ethical approaches. But naturalism, we'll look at that one first, then we'll look at moral relativism, and last, emotivism. So naturalism is ethics from scientific facts. Earlier on, we talked about Lao Tzu, and in some sense, it's similar to Lao Tzu in that nature, in other words, should be our teacher on what is right and wrong. However, this runs into certain problems. And one is what philosophers call a conflation of fact and value, that there should be a fact and value distinction. So not every fact means that there's a value. So for example, we know from evolution that animals, or genes, are selfish, right? And that in order to survive, they have to fight for themselves. Now, if we look at nature and we see that, we could draw a value statement that we have to fight for ourselves and be selfish. Now, but that doesn't seem like a very plausible way for society to live. In fact, society would fall apart if everybody was just fighting for their own interests all the time. So we know, just from looking at history, that people have to allow others to also do well, that there has to be cooperation in order for society overall to do well. And so this would be a criticism of naturalism, that we can't just look at nature to give us all the answers. And so this is the problem of going from what is to what ought to be. Now, maybe we can do that some of the time. I'm not saying that it's not impossible, but as a meta-ethical outlook, this might be a bit of a problem. No logical connection between what is and what ought to be. So another criticism of naturalism is the open question argument, and here it's summarized by Warburton. This action is likely to give rise to the most happiness for the greater number of people, but is it the morally right thing to do? If this version of naturalism were true, it would not be worth asking such a question. The answer would be obvious. As it is, the anti-naturalists argue, it remains an open question. So this is an open question, right? That if you are doing what is best for the greatest amount of people, what you're causing happiness, you can still ask the question. Like, we have all the right to ask if this is actually still the right thing to do. But if naturalism is true, then there's no difference between what is and what a value is, or what is and what ought to be, what's a fact and what's a value. And so therefore, why would you even need to ask what a morally valid thing is to do, or morally right thing is to do? You would automatically know just from saying that this is giving happiness to the greatest amount of people. So there's no way to really address that kind of open question argument. However, it does not. The open question argument is not a conclusive criticism of naturalism. So an example is this: is if I promise to pay you $10 or 10 pounds, 10 yuan, it is a fact that I speak the words, I promise to pay you 10 pounds. And if I do this sincerely, it puts me under a moral obligation to pay you 10 pounds. This seems to be a counterexample to the claim that you cannot derive an ought from an is. So there actually is and is in this situation. There's a true, which is that you have told the person that you're going to pay that money, and then there's a direct connection with what you have to do, which is to pay the money. So there are some cases where naturalism seems to be true. Another situation is this critique of naturalism is the whole thing of human nature. Jean-Paul Sartre has basically called it a self-deception, that the human condition, there's no guiding principle. There's no guidelines outside of ourselves, that we have a freedom to choose, and that humans have a responsibility for discovering what is right and wrong. And so instead of it being that there's some sort of external thing that tells us what is right and wrong, we have to decide for ourselves as humans. Well, here's some responses to naturalism, or the critique of naturalism. But then why then do we have to be responsible? What makes it right for us to be responsible, or wrong for us to be responsible? Because Jean-Paul Sartre is saying, well, we have to be responsible. But then why? What's externally telling us, or even internally telling us, that we have to be responsible? And isn't this desire for responsibility indicative of some sort of human nature? Because if we all have a responsibility, then you're saying that there's something common between humans, and that would be human nature. So even if you say all we have is responsibility, you're saying that there's human nature, which is responsibility. You're just making human nature a very narrow thing. So maybe naturalism is wrong, but I think maybe the assumption of human nature is correct. That would be my kind of take on that. So moral relativism. So you have this saying, different folks, different strokes. Have you heard that before? maybe not. It's kind of an old saying. It basically means that different cultures have different ideas, different people have different ideas of what is right and wrong, right? And we see this throughout history. Even from one time, people think that this action is good. Later on, they think it's bad, it's evil, right? And that changes over time. So is morality relative to society? So we've talked about this before, that each society needs to decide whether something is right or wrong. But there's some problems with moral relativism. So slavery was acceptable in the 18th century, but it's not acceptable today, right? So, well, actually, this isn't a problem. This is more of to demonstrate how slavery or how moral relativism kind of is an argument for moral relativism. So, it just changed over time. Actually, this is for and against. People would say that are moral relativists would say, well, see, these things change. But I think this is actually an argument against moral relativity, because I would say moral relativism, because what it actually shows is that I don't think it was right in the 18th century that they had slavery, and I don't think it's right now. But my basis for that is different than maybe what a moral relativist would say. But I would say that there must be some sort of absolute that causes the slavery to be wrong in both times, whether or not people recognize that. So in moral relativism, we find that there's no absolutes. And the idea between that and the connection with normative relativity is that, or normative moral relativism, is that you never interfere from the outside. You should never have a judgment of another culture because there's no grounds to judge another culture. So, for example, if another culture is, say, have you heard in India how in the past they used to take the women, if their husband died, that they would, they would burn the dead man, that was a cremation, where they would take the woman and also burn her with the dead man together. They'd burn them together. This is called sati. So is it wrong to judge the Indian culture and say you shouldn't do that? A moral relativist or normative moral relativist would say, yes, it's wrong to judge them. Somebody who's not a moral relativist and believes there's some absolutes would say, no, what they were doing is wrong. We should have the right to criticize that culture. But isn't that making an absolute statement? So once you say you can never judge another culture, you're making an absolute statement, which undermines moral relativism to begin with. Sorry, I guess I hadn't, maybe I just doubled that. Okay, so moral relativism. So I disagree. I don't know if you read page 62 of Warburton, but I disagree that you don't need to be a truth relativist to be an inconsistent moral relativist. So a truth relativist will say that there's no truth. It's all relative to every society. A moral relativist might believe there are truths, but that that morals are relative to each society. So, but I think that that's making a false dichotomy, because I think that morality, there should be some truth and morality are related. And so you are making an absolute moral judgment to say there are no moral absolutes. That's a moral, you're making a moral statement there, not just a truth statement. And so I think that is self-contradictory. And also, we see that, as we have seen earlier, that normative relativism is incoherent, because you can't say you can never judge another culture and not say that you're also, and that there's no absolutes, and say then you can never judge another culture, and then also be believing that that's not an absolute statement. If you're making an absolute statement that you should never judge another culture, you can't say that there's no absolutes. And if you admit that there's absolutes, then you are you're denying yourself the right to be able to say that you can make the absolute judgment that you can't judge. If that makes sense. Okay, moral relativism. What counts as a society? Also, that's another problem. No criticisms of moral values. And what if a culture like Iran does not allow women to get work or education? You have to answer that question. So there's no way that we could ever say we can't ever critique another culture. And this seems to be a little bit absurd. The last theory is, or it's part of the meta-ethics, is emotivism. And this was started by A.J. Ayer, who would say that moral judgments are just expressions of emotion, and therefore they're completely meaningless. This is also called the boo hooray theory. So basically what he's saying is all we do when somebody says something like murder is wrong, we're saying hooray because we agree with it, or we're saying boo because we disagree with it. So it's not really a logical or rational decision, but it's a completely based in your own just emotions. It's completely emotional. So there's no logic. It means that we can't actually have an argument about morality, because arguments have to be based on the belief in some sort of logic and some sort of grounds for reasoning. And all it is just a shouting match, that you're just shouting at each other for this or that. So emotivism allows for debates on terms and facts, but it still says that moral judgments are meaningless. So it was interesting. Warburton said even if it is true, if emotivism is true, it leads to dangerous consequences. So what's wrong with equating murder is wrong with murder yuck. What if your emotion is torturing little children is right? What if that's your emotion, right? So these aren't necessarily arguments to say that this theory is wrong, but it is. It would be super dangerous if this theory is believed, right? Because if people just have their basis for morality on that they think it's all emotions, then whatever their emotions lead them to do, they will think that that's the right thing to do, right? So it seems like emotivism might be more of how we express our ideas about morality better than a actual underlying theory of where our morality comes from. So concluding thoughts. Can philosophy give us easy answers to moral questions? What do you think? No? And what can philosophy provide in the discussion of ethical questions? What can it actually give us? It can actually give us two different talking points. So it could give us opposite points of view. It can allow us to really think about all the different angles of the question.
It's the same as the answer. The answer is two sides, pros and cons.
It can give us the pros and the cons.
Yeah.
So the way Warburton puts it is that it gives us a language to talk about these things, and it provides a framework to talk about these things. So like you say, basically that's what you're saying, because it gives us a way to take two sides of the question and do like a pro and a con. It enables us to actually have a framework. Okay, now we can discuss these things. And it kind of gives us, the other thing that it adds to what you're saying is that it gives us a language. It actually gives us some ways to put this into words. And we can start categorizing different arguments and actually analyzing them and see, okay, which one do I want to adhere to? Which one could we maybe as a society start to move towards? It might not be able to answer all the questions, but it's a helpful exercise in arriving at some answers, perhaps. Even if they're complicated answers, even if they're difficult answers, it doesn't mean there's no answers. It just means that there's probably not going to be an easy answer in the end. All right, well, that's everything for today.